you think we're talking about this morning? Any clue? No idea. All right, so this past week, John Baldwin actually posted this cartoon. If you can't see it, so Jesus standing there with his disciples and he says, I tell you, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. And one of the disciples goes, great. Not only do I have to forgive my brother, now I have to do math. And at the bottom it says forgive because it's easier than math. Math is hard. But almost immediately there was a comment posted on your post, right, from Myra, saying, you know what, that's not really true. Forgiving is a lot harder than math. Forgiving can be a blessing, but Jan Richardson calls it the hardest blessing because it is a difficult thing to do a lot of the time. Oftentimes we are afraid to forgive. We're afraid of rejection or attack. And so we have to think about forgiveness maybe in some new ways. The fact of the way our culture treats forgiveness is not helpful either, to be honest. We live in a society that glorifies revenge and celebrates it even. From everything from The Princess Bride to Game of Thrones, right? We live in a culture that celebrates that lone person who goes out and makes the bad guys pay, right? We also live in a society that has a justice system that doesn't understand forgiveness very well. Often people who go to jail or prison face a situation that is punitive rather than rehabilitative. And when they come out, oftentimes they're never really considered to have paid off their debt to society, even if they have finished their sentence. From things like being disenfranchised from voting, do you know there are 4 states in our country where if you are convicted of a felony, you lose your right to vote for the rest of your life. Forever and ever and ever. A 17 or 18-year-old who makes a stupid mistake, does something bad, even if they spend the next 50 years being upstanding citizens in those 4 states, they never, ever get the opportunity to vote again. But people also face discrimination and problems with employment, with housing, right? And there are a lot of, even within that, there are a lot of race and class discrepancies when it comes to our justice system. I think also of lawsuits and the idea that when people do things wrong, they are often afraid to say I'm sorry or give any kind of recognition that they did something wrong because they're afraid they're going to get sued. So instead of people being willing to say, you know, I made a mistake, I messed up, right? Also, we have this whole ethos of pride and our perception that if somebody steps on our pride and injures our pride, then that gives us a reason to lash out. How many times do we hear stories on the news and all of violence over a perceived slight that someone took or felt that was given to them? So we have to ask ourselves, what would our world look like if it was different? What if abundant forgiveness was the norm? What if that was the way our society behaved? So this whole passage that we looked at this morning is about forgiveness. Jesus starts out by talking about how we are supposed to address conflict and disagreements in the church. Of course, we never have conflict and disagreement in the church, right? Yeah. We are called to hold one another accountable and address those conflicts. And he kind of lays out this process of how we can do that. Do you notice that it's the offended person who's called to take the initiative? That if someone wrongs you, Jesus says, go and talk to them. How many times have you seen somebody in church or a situation in church where somebody just all of a sudden they stop talking with somebody, right? They pretend like they don't see them when they pass them in the hall, right? We kind of cut people out sometimes instead of going and talking to them. And we can't resolve anything if we don't go and talk, if we don't go and have a conversation. Sometimes people don't even know that they've done something to offend us. Have you ever said something and somebody took it differently than what you meant it, and you really didn't mean to hurt their feelings, right? But you did. And sometimes you don't even recognize that. You don't even realize that until they let you know. So we are required to engage those people who harm us in the church. Now, you have to remember, though, Jesus doesn't let the offender completely off the hook either. Right back in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells us if you're going to the altar to get a gift and you remember that you did, that you have a conflict with somebody else, you need to go and make things right with them, and then come back and offer your gift. So neither side gets off the hook in this. But Jesus also says that we need to address it as privately as possible, at least at first. Right? That we need to keep that circle small. Have you ever heard the term triangulation? Do you know what that means when you're talking about relationships? Okay, so it means like, Jessica, I'm going to use you for an example. Okay, so Jessica does something to hurt me, and instead of going and talking to Jessica, I go to Yvonne and I say, do you know what Jessica did to me? So what have I done? I pulled somebody else into our conflict, right? And now she's her mother, so you got to imagine that's not true. But, so what have I done? Now I've made Yvonne mad at Jessica too, right? And Jessica didn't do anything to Yvonne, right? So we need to avoid that. We need to keep things as private as possible. And finally, Jesus says, the goal is reconciliation. The objective isn't punishment, but restoration of community. So we need to approach that other person with care and respect. We need to look at it as an opportunity to build our relationship back instead of tear that other person down. And I think that one of the things that helps with that, hopefully in the church, is that as we get to know each other on a deeper basis, we get to know one another's stories. I know Jessica well enough to know that if she says something hurtful to me, she's either having a bad day, right, which we all do, or it didn't come out, I didn't take it the way she meant it. I know that Jessica, as my sister in Christ, is not going to intentionally try to harm me. And so when we know each other and we get to know each other, we can be a little more understanding towards each other. But Jesus says, okay, well, sometimes you go and you talk to the person, and then you go and you take a witness, and then you go and you bring it to the church, and the person still is not going to make things right. And he says, then you need to treat them as a Gentile and a tax collector. And sometimes that gets interpreted as kicking the bums out. But let me ask you a question. Who did Jesus get in trouble for hanging out with in the Bible? Gentiles and tax collectors, right? So we need to look at people who are unrepentant as objects of mission and love, of people to be won back to Christ and won back to the community. Now, also as Jesus is talking about this, then one of the disciples comes up and says, okay, how often do I have to forgive somebody? And some of them say 77 times, some say 7 times 70. The point here is, in the Bible, 7 is a perfect number. So it means infinity, forever, again, and again, and again. It's not a specific time. You can't keep a tally. Okay, I hit 76 times. Next time I'll forgive them. After that, too bad, right? It means again and again and again. And this is enforced in the parable that we sang that Jesus tells about. The absurdity of these numbers. So it says that the one servant owes the king in that story 10,000 talents. That's 150,000 years worth of wages. Could anybody ever pay that back? If you do the math, I found something that kind of did, in today's money, that would be $7.5 billion. Right, yeah, I'm going to pay that back, right? You're right. But that's the whole point. The whole point is these numbers are so huge and so unbelievable that we're supposed to look look into that absurdity and realize that Jesus is saying, forgive again and again. But then Jesus also shows this tension between divine forgiveness and human forgiveness. We just prayed it again. In the Lord's Prayer, what do we say? Forgive us our sins as we forgive. Yeah. Jesus seems to see this connection, this tension between the way that we forgive others and the way that God forgives us. Now, there are a lot of myths about forgiveness out there, and a lot of questions about forgiveness. I am sure that as we talk about forgiveness, we think of a lot of those questions go through our head. Do I have to just forgive forgiveness automatically? Does somebody have to say they're sorry before I forgive them? Is there anything that's unforgivable? One resource that if you are a reader and like to read, I would encourage you to pick up this book, The Sunflower, by Simon Wiesenthal. It's a story of, he was a prisoner of war in a concentration camp during World War II. And he was called to the bedside of a Nazi soldier who was dying. And the soldier wanted to confess to a Jew the horrible atrocities that he had committed and be forgiven by a Jew because he knew he was dying. So in the first half of the story, Simon tells the story of how this happened and what happened as he was called into this hospital room and all. And I won't tell you what he decides or how it ends. But the second half of the book is about 45 different religious leaders responding to what they think forgiveness really means and how they might have responded. It's a very moving book. So when we think that, and they're all over the board, so this is a complicated subject, right? A lot of times because of these myths that we have about forgiveness. So one of those myths. Forgiveness means excusing the harm that's been done to us and saying everything is okay. No, not necessarily. There needs to be, even if it's for yourself, a naming and a holding to account, right? You need to be able to name the hurt that has been done to you. And it would be really good if the other person could name it, but sometimes that doesn't happen. Think of, like in South Africa, where they did the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, right? Where people came forward and admitted the things that they had done, and there was this acknowledgement of the wrongs that had happened. And this is especially true, I would say, where there's a power imbalance between the person who has offended and the person who has been offended. There needs to be a naming of what has happened. If you notice in the parable, the forgiveness is from the top down. It's the king who forgives the servant. It's not the servant who has to forgive the king. So we need to keep those power imbalances in mind as we think about forgiveness. Second, forgiveness means allowing those who have hurt us to persist in their behavior. No. And unfortunately, the church has been guilty of perpetuating this myth.
Turn the other cheek.
Turn the other cheek, right? Well, turn the other cheek doesn't mean to keep letting people persist in their bad behavior. There is a necessity to create boundaries. If you don't, it can be dangerous. I saw this actually happen in Dearborn, at the church I was at. There was a woman there who was very emotionally unhealthy. And to the point of she had hurt a lot of people in the congregation. And thankfully, before I came, the interim pastor had gotten the leadership together and sat down with her and said, for the next year, you are not allowed to serve in any leadership capacity in this congregation. They put some boundaries around her. They set her aside and said, we love you, but your behavior is not acceptable. And we need to do that because if we don't, what often happens, we have this idea of the gospel of nice, right? But what happens with the gospel of nice? Bullies are able to take over and do what they want and say what they want, and we don't want to ruffle any feathers. We want to be nice. What we need to say is that everyone is welcome and everyone is loved, but not every behavior is welcome. There's a difference, right? If you're hurting someone else, that's not okay. Also, sometimes another myth is forgiving requires forgetting what has happened. Well, in the best possible situation, eventually we'll be able to forget, but some things are so traumatic, they imprint themselves so deeply in our psyche that we're never going to be able to forget. Or not be able to forget, but never be able to forget. But forgiveness can still take place. Another one, forgiveness is something we can do at will and always at once. Okay, I decided I'm going to forgive you. I just forgave you. It's all over. Does that work? Not usually, right? Forgiveness takes practice. We have to keep coming back at it, and we have to choose to work at it. One of the commentators I looked at this week said, when Jesus says forgive 70 times 7 or 77 times, we usually take that as if the person comes back and hurts you that many times, that you have to keep forgiving them. But the reality is also sometimes you have to forgive the same offense multiple times. Have you ever had a situation where you thought you had forgiven something, and then something happens and it comes back up in your brain and you realize, oh, I guess I really didn't let that go yet. Right? Yeah. Another one. Okay, and this is, so on the front of your bulletins, my guess is Don Henley of the Eagles does not make the front of church bulletins very often. But part of one of his songs is on there called Heart of the Matter. Because at the end of the song, he really gets into some deep things about forgiveness that we're talking about. Another myth is that forgiveness must always end in reconciliation. One of the lines in that song is, even if, he's talking about forgiveness, and he says, even if you don't love me anymore. Sometimes reconciliation is not possible. Sometimes reconciliation can be dangerous. If you're in a situation where there's abuse, physical, emotional, whatever kind of abuse, reconciliation can be dangerous. Sometimes the trust in a relationship has been damaged so bad, so deeply, that reconciliation is not possible. So, if these are some myths about forgiveness and some things that are not necessarily what Jesus is talking about, what does it mean to forgive? Well, let's look at a few of those things, okay? Some truths about forgiveness. First of all, forgiveness is a grateful response to God's forgiveness. God has forgiven us, and in thanksgiving and response, we are called to forgive others. We are called out of grateful response to God's forgiveness to forgive others. Also, forgiveness is a letting go. The Greek word that gets used for forgiveness here actually means to let go. Okay? It's the freedom to let go of the hurt and move forward in peace. To let go of the hurt and move forward in peace. It may mean closing doors on a relationship that's unhealthy and then letting go of any resentment we carry for that person. There's a story about two Buddhist monks who were on a trail, walking on a long trip. There was an older monk and a younger monk, and they came to a river. And there was a beautiful young woman there wanting to get across the river. And she looks at the monks and she says, "Can you help me get across?" And the two monks kind of look at each other because their vows required that they not touch a woman. But the older monk walks up to the woman, he puts her on his back, carries her across the river, puts her down. After a minute, the younger monk comes along and they continue their journey. And as they're walking for several hours, and neither one of them say anything. But in the younger monk's head, he's just not, he can't believe that this older monk picked up this woman, touched a woman, and carried her across the river. And finally, he can't stand it anymore. So he says to the older monk, he says, you picked up this, we're not allowed to touch women, you picked up this woman and you carried her across the river. How could you do that? And the older monk looks at him and says, you know, I carried the woman across the river and then I put her down. Why are you still carrying her? Sometimes we have to let go. We have to let go. We have to put it down. Forgiveness is also a process. Again, Don Henley talks about wanting to forgive, but he says, but my will gets weak and my thoughts start to scatter. Sometimes forgiving is kind of like grieving. How many of you have ever grieved the loss of someone you love? Is that something that happens all at once? I think of grieving, and I think in forgiveness as well, a lot of times as a spiral, right? You keep often coming back around to the same place. Hopefully that spiral is changing each time, but sometimes it keeps coming back around and around. And so we have to understand that it's a process. And sometimes the very first step of that process is asking God for even the desire to want to forgive. Sometimes we don't even have that desire, and we have to ask God for that desire. And finally, forgiveness is often for the sake of the injured person, not the one who has injured them. Again, Don Henley says, you keep carrying that anger, it'll eat you up inside. Carrying anger and unforgiveness will eat us up inside. We may not be able to change what happened. We may not be able to change the behavior of the other person, but we can control how we respond. Lewis Smedes writes, to forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that prisoner was you. And one of my favorite all-time Anne Lamott quotes, I may have shared this with you before, but I love this. She says, unforgiveness is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. Right? It eats us up. Unforgiveness is like drinking rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die. Right? Yeah. Yeah. It's not hurting the rat if I drink rat poison, right?
We have time change.
That's true. When we decide to forgive, what we do is we refuse to let another person's sin control us, to let it bind us or hold us. The alternative to forgiveness is a heart that grows hard and carries resentment. In the end, I think part of the question becomes about how do you want to go through the world? How do you want to live in this world? How do you want to leave this world? Again, at the end of the song, Don Henley says, because the flesh will get weak and the ashes will scatter. So I'm thinking about forgiveness. We are all going to weaken. And someday our ashes will be scattered. How do we want to go through this life? With bitterness? With anger? How do we want to leave this world when it comes to that point at the end? Do we want to leave this world with unresolved anger, with bitterness towards people that have harmed us? Or do we want to go free, knowing that we have let it go? I entitled my message this morning, The Hardest Blessing, and that comes, as I said at the very beginning, from a poem by Jan Richardson. And as I close, I'm going to just read that poem for you. It's called The Hardest Blessing by Jan Richardson. If we cannot lay aside the wound, then let us say it will not always bind us. Let us say the damage will not eternally determine our path. Let us say the line of our life will not forever follow the tearing, the rending we have borne. Let us say that forgiveness can take some practice, can take some patience, can take a long and struggling time. Let us say that to offer the hardest blessing, we will need the deepest grace. That to forgive the sharpest pain, we will need the fiercest love. That to release the ancient ache, we will need new strength for every day. Let us say the wound will not be our final home. That through it runs a road, a way we would not have chosen, but on which we will finally see forgiveness, so long practiced, coming toward us, shining with the joy so well deserved. Forgiveness. I would invite you to just take a minute to think if there are unresolved conflicts in your life that you need to address. Maybe you're working on it. Maybe it's something that's really hard. But I would invite you to keep working at it, to not give up, to know that God will give us strength if we ask for it. I invite you to continue walking that path of forgiveness, to not let those hurts define you and bind you, but to set yourself free.